Welcome to our deep dives today. We're going to be looking at Frankenstein by Mary Shelley.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And we've got
classic.
Yeah, a classic. And we've got some excerpts from the novel and some great commentary alongside it.
Nice.
And we really want to get under the skin of the creature today.
Okay.
So we want to see how he develops as a character, and then we're going to analyze how that kind of reflects all those like big social and philosophical anxieties of the Romantic era.
Yeah, it's interesting how she doesn't just present you with a monster, right? She gives you this character
Right.
with like a really complex inner life. And she does that by kind of exploring this whole idea of human duality.
Yeah.
Like the potential for good and evil that exists in all of us.
Yeah, and she throws that at us right away, like from the get-go. The Satyr's just trying to make sense of the world.
Right.
And he's just blown away by how humans can be so virtuous and vicious.
Well, and you have to remember that he's like grappling with all this while he's reading Paradise Lost.
Oh, yeah.
You know John Milton's epic poem about the fall of Satan and humanity's expulsion from the Garden of Eden?
Yeah, which, as our source points out, is like some pretty heavy stuff for a developing mind.
Totally.
It's like giving someone a crash course in good and evil, but through this lens of a fallen angel. It's no wonder he starts to identify with Satan, right?
Yeah, exactly. But it's not just about the content of Paradise Lost, though. It's about his isolation.
Right.
He doesn't have anyone to guide him, no one to offer a different perspective to this bleak worldview.
Oh, that's a good point.
You know, can you imagine trying to make sense of complex philosophical ideas on your own?
Yeah.
Without a mentor or a teacher to kind of help you navigate all the nuances?
Yeah, that's a great point. It's like the difference between Superman, who has Jor-El and Jonathan Kent to guide him.
Exactly.
And the creature who is just kind of left to figure it all out on his own.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think his understanding of humanity would have been different?
Absolutely.
If he had a more positive influence in his life?
Absolutely. I think the absence of a balanced mentor figure is key to understanding why he fixates on the darker aspects of Paradise Lost.
Okay.
You know, it feeds this sense of isolation and reinforces this belief that he's inherently flawed and rejected.
Yeah.
You know, it makes me wonder if with the right guidance, he might have seen himself more as a tragic hero rather than this monstrous villain.
Oh, that's such an interesting thought. And it makes me think about how relevant that idea still is today. You know, like all these discussions about like the influence of media.
Oh, totally.
And the importance of having good role models.
For sure.
But moving on, the source material also mentions how the creature deals with social inequality.
Right.
I mean, it's not just about being different. It's about being thrust into this world.
Exactly.
With this rigid social hierarchy.
Exactly. He becomes very aware that respect in this society is totally tied to wealth and lineage.
Right.
You know, he sees himself as an outcast, not just because of how he looks, but because he lacks the social standing that would grant him any kind of acceptance.
Yeah.
You know, to use Shelley's words, he sees himself as a vagabond and a slave.
And this really reflects the social concerns of the Romantic era, doesn't it?
Oh, for sure.
Think about Mary Wollstonecraft.
Right.
Shelley's own mother.
Yeah.
And her work on societal perceptions. She wrote letters written in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark.
Yeah.
And she had this amazing passage about how people viewed slaves back then.
Wollstonecraft was so ahead of her time in recognizing that those negative perceptions were really based on prejudice and lack of opportunity.
Right.
And not on any kind of inherent differences.
Yes.
You know, she pointed out that when people are denied education and the chance to improve their lives, it's unfair to judge them as being inherently inferior.
Right. She's saying it's not about some innate flaw, it's about systemic inequality.
Exactly.
Which resonates with the creature's experience, right?
Totally.
Because he's denied acceptance, not because of who he is, but because of how society perceives him.
Absolutely. And this sense of longing for connection, for belonging, is something that was also explored by another major figure of the Romantic era, Percy Shelley, Mary's husband.
Interesting. How so? I know Percy Shelley was a poet, but I didn't realize his work connected to Frankenstein in this way.
So in his essay on love, Percy Shelley writes about this deep yearning for connection. And the frustration that comes from feeling misunderstood.
Right.
He talks about seeing similarities in others, but when he tries to connect on a deeper level, he finds only repulse and disappointment.
Wow. So both of Mary Shelley's parents contributed to this idea of the creature's turmoil.
Absolutely.
It's like this family legacy of exploring these themes of social injustice and the desire for connection.
It shows how deeply these ideas were embedded in the intellectual landscape of that time period.
Yeah.
These weren't just abstract concepts. They were lived experiences that shaped the way they viewed themselves and the world around them.
It makes you wonder how Mary Shelley's own life might have shaped her portrayal of the creature.
Right.
But before we go too deep into that, I want to talk about another layer that the source material brings up.
Okay.
Paradise Lost as a shared experience.
Okay.
It's fascinating how Shelley creates this unique connection between the creature and the reader by having us both engage with the same text.
Yeah, it's like she's inviting us into a book club with the creature, right?
Yeah.
We're all wrestling with these ideas, trying to make sense of this epic story of good and evil. It brings up some interesting questions about interpretation.
Right. And speaking of interpretation, our source mentions I.A. Richards.
Yeah.
And his idea from the philosophy of rhetoric.
Okay.
That words and images can hold all and none of their potential meanings at the same time.
Right.
And that meaning is ultimately shaped by individual interpretation.
Right. But then we have Kenneth Burke offering a different perspective in a rhetoric of motives.
Okay.
He argues that our interpretations aren't formed in a vacuum.
Okay.
We're also influenced by shared guiding principles and the hierarchies of our culture.
So when it comes to the creature in Paradise Lost, it's not just about what he takes away from the text. It's about how his interpretation is shaped by that broader cultural context of the Romantic era.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting, because we as modern readers are bringing our own baggage to the text as well.
So there's no single correct way to understand the creature's reaction to Paradise Lost.
That's the beauty of it. It's like this open invitation to think critically about how our own experiences and our cultural frameworks shape our understanding of the story.
Yeah.
What resonates with you? What makes you uncomfortable?
Right.
These are all clues to how you're interpreting the text and how that influences your understanding of him.
It's like Shelley is encouraging us to become active participants in the story, not just passive observers.
Yeah.
But speaking of active participation,
Okay.
let's talk about the moment where the creature takes things into his own hands.
Okay.
The moment he decides to declare war on humanity.
Yeah.
That's a pretty dramatic turning point, wouldn't you say?
It is a dramatic shift.
Yeah.
And it really challenges us to examine his motivations.
Yeah.
Is he simply lashing out?
Right.
Or is there a deeper justification for his actions?
Well, the source material points out that the creature's violence isn't random.
Right.
It's not mindless. It's very calculated. Like, he chooses to target those who represent the social structures that have oppressed him.
Right.
It's almost like he's trying to dismantle the systems that have denied him his humanity.
Yeah.
It's a form of rebellion, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's a way of fighting back against the forces that have shaped his destiny. He can't change how he looks. He can't rewrite his origins.
Right.
But he can strike back at the people and institutions that represent everything he's been denied.
Which brings me to another point that the source material raises.
Okay.
The creature's fixation on Victor's loved ones.
Right.
Why go after them specifically?
Yeah.
I mean, it seems particularly cruel.
Yeah.
Even for a creature who's declared war on humanity.
I think it's important to remember that his actions are driven by this profound sense of longing and loss.
Okay.
He desires connection, family love, acceptance.
Right.
All the things that Victor has, but that he's been denied.
So it's not just about revenge.
Right.
It's about striking at the heart of what Victor holds dear.
Yes.
It's a way of making him feel the same pain that the creature has endured.
Precisely. And while it's certainly a dark and twisted expression of his desires,
yeah,
it also speaks to the depths of his emotional turmoil. He can't experience those bonds himself.
Right.
So he seeks to destroy them in others.
It's like a dark reflection of the human capacity for both love and hate, isn't it?
Exactly.
The same emotions that drive us to create beauty and connection can also lead to destruction and isolation.
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons I think this book continues to resonate with readers centuries after it was written.
Yeah.
It forces us to confront that full spectrum of human experience, the light and the shadow.
It definitely makes you think about the consequences of our actions. Right, both individually and as a society.
Yeah.
I mean, we've been talking about the creature's responsibility for his choices.
Right.
But what about Victor's responsibility?
Yeah.
I mean, he created this being.
Yeah.
And then abandoned him to fend for himself.
Right.
In a world that was hostile from the start.
That's the central question at the heart of the novel, isn't it?
Yeah.
Who bears the ultimate responsibility for the tragedy that unfolds? Is it the creator or the creation?
Right.
Or is it something more complex? A tangled web of actions and reactions that lead to this devastating outcome.
And I think that's what makes the creature such a compelling character.
Yeah.
He's not just a monster. He's this complex being grappling with these profound questions of identity and belonging and the meaning of existence.
Right.
It's hard not to feel some sympathy for him.
I agree.
Even while being horrified by his actions.
I agree. And I think the complexity is why he continues to fascinate and terrify us.
Yeah.
He's a reflection of ourselves, of the darkest impulses that lurk within the human heart, but also of our deepest desires for connection and acceptance.
It reminds me of what we were talking about earlier with Paradise Lost.
Right.
And the power of literature to shape our understanding of the world.
Yeah.
The creature finds solace in those pages.
Right.
But it also fuels his despair.
It's a great example of how the same text can be interpreted in vastly different ways, depending on the reader's own experiences and biases.
Right.
The creature sees his own suffering reflected in the story of Satan's fall, while other readers might find messages of redemption or hope.
It really highlights the importance of engaging with literature critically, doesn't it?
It does.
We need to question our own assumptions and consider multiple perspectives.
Totally.
And be mindful of the power that stories have to shape our understanding of ourselves and others.
Absolutely. And I think Frankenstein is a perfect example of a text that demands that kind of critical engagement.
Yeah.
It's not a passive read. It's a conversation, a challenge of provocation.
This has been such a fascinating discussion. We've covered so much ground, from the creature's early development to his descent into violence and his complex relationship with literature. And we've also touched on some pretty big questions about responsibility, justice, and the nature of good and evil.
And we've only just scratched the surface.
Right.
There's so much more to explore in Shelley's masterpiece.
Which is exactly what makes a deep dive like this so rewarding.
Right.
It's about uncovering those hidden layers and revealing the complexity that lies beneath the surface.
And it's about sparking curiosity and encouraging our listeners to continue exploring these ideas on their own.
Well, before we send our listener off to do just that, there's one more crucial aspect we need to address.
Okay.
The creature's ultimate fate and the lasting impact of Frankenstein on popular culture. I mean, we can't leave them hanging without exploring how this iconic story has resonated through the years.
I completely agree. The story of Frankenstein doesn't end with the final page of the novel. It continues to evolve and transform as it's reinterpreted and reimagined in different contexts,
right.
And understanding that evolution can give us even deeper insights into the enduring power of Shelley's creation.
So are you ready to dive into the final chapter of our Frankenstein dive?
I am. I'm ready. We've talked about his development and his motivations and how he reflects those social and philosophical ideas of the Romantic era.
Right.
But what happens to him in the end?
Right.
And how has his story echoed through time? How has it continued to be relevant?
Well, the creature's fate is both tragic and thought-provoking.
Yeah.
Consumed by guilt and remorse for the suffering he's caused, he ultimately chooses self-destruction.
It's a powerful moment, isn't it? He recognizes the horror of his actions,
right.
And he decides to end his own existence rather than continue that cycle of violence.
Right.
There's a sense of despair there, but also this flicker of self-awareness that adds another dimension to his story. It does, and it brings up this concept of responsibility, which is woven throughout the whole novel.
Right.
It's not just about Victor's responsibility for creating him, but also about the individual's responsibility for their choices.
Right.
Even when those choices are shaped by forces beyond their control.
It's a pretty bleak outlook, though, isn't it? I mean, is there any hope to be found in this story?
Hope might not be the right word, but there's definitely room for reflection and learning. Shelley's not giving us easy answers. She's forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature.
Right.
And the potential consequences of our actions, especially as we continue to push the boundaries of scientific advancement.
And that's a big part of why Frankenstein remains so relevant today.
Totally.
Over 200 years after it was written. It's not just a horror story. It's a cautionary tale.
Right.
It makes us think about the dangers of unchecked ambition.
Right.
And the need for empathy and understanding.
Yeah.
And the importance of taking responsibility for the things we create.
Exactly. And think about how those themes resonate with contemporary discussions about AI genetic engineering.
Oh, yeah.
And all the ethical implications of scientific progress.
Right.
The questions she raised back then are even more urgent now.
It's amazing how a story written centuries ago can still feel so timely and thought-provoking.
Yeah.
But it's not just the themes that have endured, right?
Right.
The creature himself has become this iconic figure in popular culture,
Totally.
Inspiring countless adaptations, reinterpretations, even parodies.
Absolutely. From Boris Karloff's portrayal in the classic Universal films to more modern interpretations in movies like Victor Frankenstein.
Right.
He continues to capture our imagination and reflect our evolving anxieties about technology and the nature of humanity.
But do you think those pop culture representations always capture the complexity of Shelley's original creation?
That's a great question. While those adaptations can be entertaining and thought-provoking in their own right, they often simplify the story, focusing more on the horror element and less on the nuanced exploration of human nature and social responsibility that make the novel so powerful.
So what would you say is the biggest takeaway from our deep dive into Frankenstein?
Okay.
What do you hope our listener will walk away with?
I think the most important thing is to encourage our listener to go back to the source.
Okay.
To engage with Shelley's text and grapple with the questions she raises.
Right.
And I think it's also crucial to remember that the creature, despite being viewed as a monster, embodies this deep longing for connection, understanding, and acceptance.
Yeah.
Qualities that are inherently human, even in their most discorded forms.
It's a great reminder that even in the darkest corners of our imagination, there's a glimmer of humanity waiting to be recognized.
Yeah.
And with that, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into Frankenstein. It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope you've enjoyed exploring the depths of this timeless masterpiece.
It has been a pleasure. And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep exploring the world with a curious mind.
That's great advice. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.